welcome to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Jahnke. We just had another fun day of football, Week 16, the fantasy football semifinal round. I hope all of your fantasy matchups are going well. I hope you don't need too much for Monday Night Football. Hopefully locked up that championship round match before that game, but we just had a fun Buccaneers-Cowboys game. Definitely interesting game for a game that shouldn't have been that interesting. We thought the Cowboys being eliminated from the playoffs might not have been that competitive. A number of injuries in the game, but a very hard-fought game, very entertaining to watch for a matchup that didn't seem like it would have been that entertaining going into it. But we had an interesting day of football overall. A couple injuries, a couple of teams reacting to injuries they already had, a couple players having their best games of the season, one player getting benched. So I'm going to jump right into it. We've had some days where we're talking all running backs, some days we're talking all wide receivers. Today we have a variety of positions to cover. We will start with the running back position with the Tennessee Titans, a team where both running backs played in this game and played throughout the game, but we saw Tyjae Spears play the majority of offensive snaps for the second straight week for the Tennessee Titans and scored 2 touchdowns for the second straight week. Spears was the better fantasy option of the two, ran 10 times, led the team in carries, had 27 yards and those 2 touchdowns, also caught 3 passes for 39 yards, where Pollard only had 8 carries for 35 yards, so a better yards per carry, caught 2 passes for 5 yards. But it had been a disappointing performance by Pollard. He has been dealing with injuries for the past couple weeks, which has likely impacted him. And then the game scripts of these past 2 games where the Titans are falling behind early has also impacted things. We saw in the first quarter of the game, Pollard played 11 of 15 snaps, so it seemed like a normal game in the first quarter for Pollard. Ran the ball 5 times, but only ran the ball 3 times over the rest of the game. Spears played 33 of 46 snaps from the second quarter on, so a lot of it probably had to do with the game script, but even earlier in the season when the game script was falling out of hand, we were still seeing Pollard on the field for a decent amount of passing down work. So this could be a combination of Spears getting healthier than he has been at other points in the season, Pollard not being as healthy. I think this will be interesting to keep an eye on over these next 2 weeks. The Titans out of playoff contention, and if Pollard isn't at 100%, it is a situation where they could decide to shut Pollard down for the last 2 games of the season. If he's not 100%, that could be the smart thing to do. And we really haven't seen a ton of Spears this season outside of these past 2 weeks, so it could be good to see Spears play a bit more. So I think the Titans, even though they probably haven't been the most talked about, Pollard might not have been someone that you were starting, or if you were starting, probably disappointed in the outcome. But the Titans do play the Jacksonville Jaguars next week. It's a matchup where if Pollard is healthy, we should probably go back to seeing Pollard as the main running back. That shouldn't be a game that's getting out of hand, even if the Jaguars end up winning the game. If anything, I would expect a close matchup. So I would expect a lot more Pollard, but a lot just depends on the injury, and he's been dealing with it for a few weeks now. So if Pollard shows up on the injury report, if he's not practicing some weeks, if he's listed as questionable again, like he was this week and the week before, then there's a chance that we see a lot of Spears, and the Jaguars have allowed plenty of fantasy points to running backs. So this backfield, I think, is one definitely worth watching over the rest of this week just to see how things shake out, because we could see one of these 2 backs have a very good fantasy performance in the fantasy championship round, given their matchup. Other running back situation I wanted to cover today is the Las Vegas Raiders. I know there were a lot of backfields that have been impacted by injuries. 49ers, for example, are one, but a lot of those backfields were pretty straightforward in how their running backs rotated. If you go look at my recap article, which is up at pff.com right now and is free for anyone to read, I go over every single game, including all of these running back situations where there is some sort of injury involved. And you can see how the running backs were used, Detroit, Cleveland, 2 others, where things had to change based on a running back landing on injured reserve. But I think the Raiders were the most interesting one to me just because they were the least straightforward in how the rotation worked out. With both Detroit and Cleveland, it was just and San Francisco was just a pretty clear, here is the new lead running back. Where with the Raiders, we saw Zamir White land on injured reserve a couple weeks ago and had been out for a couple weeks before that. But it was Sincere McCormick, who had been taking over as the lead running back, ended up on injured reserve this past week. So today it was Alexander Mattison and Amir Abdullah, which is what we expect for the rest of the season. Both running backs who started the season as receiving backs for the Raiders, but both had played in all situations in this game. It was a rotation that we don't see, or at least haven't seen too often in the NFL this season, where we saw one running back kind of take the lead for a couple of drives, and then the other running back would take the lead for a couple of drives. Not quite playing 100%, but playing roughly 80% of snaps or more over the course of their drives. So it was Madison first, then Abdullah, then back to Madison, then back to Abdullah, then back to Madison just a little bit at the end. So Madison led the rotation, but it was Abdullah who ended up with more fantasy points. Madison ran the most for 12 carries, but only gained 27 yards on those carries. Caught 4 passes for 29 yards, where Abdullah only ran the ball 7 times, but ended up with 38 yards. So much better rushing yards total. And then had 5 receptions for 47 yards. So was also more involved in the passing game. Both running backs scored a rushing touchdown this week. So if anyone had to start one of these running backs this past week, you were likely happy with how they performed with a couple of receptions and a touchdown each. Based on the usage in this game, I would expect Madison to be the one to get more fantasy production next week. But it's also a case where the Raiders' backfield has been fluid throughout the season. Any running back who has played well has been given more playing time. We saw Madison get more playing time early in the season, then White earned playing time again, and then McCormick slowly but surely gained more playing time. So I wouldn't be all that surprised if Abdullah ends up starting next week because he was the better player in this game. And it's been fluid enough that it makes sense to just go with whatever running back is performing the best. So I would expect this to be a pretty close 50-50 split again next week. Probably one that I'd want to avoid for fantasy football purposes, but if you're in a situation where you have no choice and have to start any running back who is going to see any kind of significant playing time, then both of these options have at least decent floors, because I don't think either running back's going to end up playing 80% of snaps or 70% of snaps or anything like that. I think regardless of who ends up ahead, it'll be one of these two running backs, but both should see a decent amount of playing time. Next situation I want to cover is at wide receiver, where we saw Olamide Zaccheaus have a very good game this week, caught 5 passes, 70 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And it wasn't just a fluky, he just started playing well. He has been an interesting case all season. He has a history of being a slot receiver back in his time with the Atlanta Falcons, and then last year with the Philadelphia Eagles. But he started his time with Washington fighting with Diami Brown for the outside wide receiver spot opposite of Terry McLaurin. Fell down the depth chart when they added Noah Brown at the beginning of the season, but then he moved back to the slot, slowly but surely took playing time from Luke McCaffrey. Had been playing decently well in the slot. And then recently, we saw Noah Brown land on injured reserve, and then we also saw Jamison Crowder, who had been on injured reserve for basically the entire season, come back, and Crowder is primarily a slot receiver, as is Luke McCaffrey. So we've seen Zaccheaus see an increase in playing time both last week, and then this week it was an even more significant increase in playing time, was basically the clear number 2 wide receiver, playing both in the slot and the outside, moving around a lot. Playing against his former team, which certainly can't hurt, but he played very well against his former team, and he plays his other former team next week, facing the Atlanta Falcons, another team who has given up a lot of fantasy points to wide receivers. So he is someone that in the majority of fantasy leagues, if you're in a normal 10-team league, even a pretty normal 12-team league, probably not going to trust Zaccheaus this week. You probably have better wide receiver options. But I know, like, I'm in a 32-team league. I know other people who are in very deep leagues or leagues where you're starting a lot of wide receivers. And a lot of times when we talk about waiver wire options, all of the guys we're talking about in those leagues already taken But I think Zacchaeus is one of those players who very well could be available in some of these deeper leagues. And if you are in need of a wide receiver, I think there's a chance that he can have another big game. We've seen the Washington number 2 wide receiver have a pretty safe floor throughout the season when it was Noah Brown. So I think Zacchaeus for one more game can have another pretty solid performance, again, facing one of his former teams, which could help him. But I just thought that was an interesting player kind of coming out of nowhere and having a big game, but also one that occurred in a way that feels like it could be sustainable based on his increase in playing time, increase in routes run, variety of ways that he's been used all season, and it's kind of getting put all together at this point in the season. Next situation I want to talk about, going back to the Tennessee Titans, is their tight end situation, where it's another player who is playing very well this late in the season, and it is Chig Okonkwo. Played 52 snaps, ran 30 routes, which was huge for him, playing more playing time than we have basically ever seen throughout his career, which was very good to see. And then he caught 9 passes for 81 yards. And this is the second straight game where he's had a big performance. Caught 8 passes last week. The only reason I wasn't more excited for him last week is we saw Josh Whyle also catch a lot of passes, and Whyle was catching a lot of passes, particularly in the fourth quarter when Mason Rudolph became the quarterback. So I was a little bit worried that Rudolph would have a lot of chemistry with Whyle, and that could contribute to Whyle seeing more playing time this week. We had kind of seen Okonkwo and Whyle split playing time at times, or Whyle at least taking significant snaps in passing situations where Nick Vannett has been the rundown tight end throughout the season, or tight end in 2 tight end sets, those kind of things. So the playing time throughout the year has fluctuated, but he dominated playing time this game. He dominated targets this week. Mason Rudolph probably going to start next week as well. And if the tight end position is his favorite position to target so far this year, there's a chance that he could have another fairly decent game. So on my tight end waiver wire article, he is the top tight end option, kind of by a decent distance. So I think there's a chance he could continue playing well, and hopefully he does, because then he could probably be a sleeper tight end target throughout the offseason as well. Hopefully can continue to have a big role in the offense, and potentially we could see the Titans upgrade at quarterback next year. It'll be interesting to see what they do, but potentially with a better quarterback option, we could see even more production in the future. Last tight end situation I want to cover, ending on a less positive note, and that is Brenton Strange. He was a popular waiver wire target this past week at tight end. With Evan Ingram on injured reserve, we saw Strange completely take over Ingram's snaps last week. Strange was basically a full-time starter early in the season as well when Ingram was out. Strange having some very good games, and last week caught 11 passes for 73 yards. So Strange seemed like a fairly safe option. I had him ranked in the top 12. I know a lot of people were starting him in their fantasy leagues, but Strange only caught 2 passes for 22 yards in this game. And it seemed like he got benched late in the first half. He caught a pass, had enough yards for a first down, got the team in field goal range, but then he fumbled the ball, lost the fumble, so the Jaguars were not able to capitalize on the good field position with a score. Could have very well impacted the game in general, because the Jaguars only lost by a score this week, so if things happened differently, the Jaguars could have ended up winning this game. Strange, in the first half, his playing time was very normal. Was out for a couple of plays, but that's been normal for the Jaguars starting tight end throughout this season. Still looked decent throughout the first half. Just wasn't seeing enough targets. But then in the second half, the very first drive of the half, it looked like Strange was already in the doghouse. Only played 4 of the 9 snaps on the first drive. None of the passing plays. Both of the other tight ends ran routes on that first drive of the third quarter. Then the following drive of the quarter, Strange was targeted on a pass. It was a weird play where the ball kind of hit him in the back of the hand. It seemed like it may have been slightly tipped by a defender. It was a little hard to tell based on the footage, but He was looking for a penalty on that play, did not get a penalty, and that was Strange's last offensive snap for the entire game. So something about that play seemed to make the coaching staff unhappy enough to take Strange out for the rest of the game. Not exactly sure why. Hopefully it's a situation where we hear something from the coaches at some point to find out what was up with Strange, but it's going to be pretty hard to trust him next week, even though he has the potential for a big game. But just knowing that if the Jaguars coaching staff was fine benching him this week, they could very well be fine benching him again next week. So he becomes a much more risky play, which is pretty disappointing since he is someone that I thought was playing well when given the opportunity this season. Someone I thought could potentially win the starting job next year, maybe fight for one of those top 12 tight end spots next year if things were going right. So this seemed like a pretty bad step in the wrong direction, but also a chance where the Jaguars might have a different coaching staff next year, and a new coaching staff might view Strange completely differently than how this coaching staff did, or the tight end situation in general. So a lot can change between this year and next year, but at least in the very short term, while Strange was someone that was probably going to be at the top of my waiver wire list had he played well in this game, now he's probably not going to be in the waiver wire article because I would have a very hard time trusting him in my lineup after this game and after him not playing. Probably best case scenario is we find out he had some kind of minor injury. To what I could find, there was no report of that, but there's also that possibility that he just suffered an injury, and that could have impacted things as well. So that is going to cover it for the recap this week, and that is going to cover it for these Sunday night recaps for the season, since all of the recaps are not just what happened in the game, but also looking ahead to what this means going forward. And since next week is the last week of the fantasy season, there's not really a game the following week to look forward to for fantasy purposes. So that will wrap it up for the season. I want to thank everyone who has been listening to this podcast throughout the year, whether you've been tuning in live or following along sometime after the fact. Definitely happy with everyone who has been listening or not listening to any of our other podcasts, have been reading the articles this year. We'll still have the Monday Night Football recap as my last written recap for the season. We'll still have the waiver wire recap with John on Tuesday morning, and we'll also have the waiver wire article out tomorrow. There will not be a start-sit article this week because both of the holiday as well as the games happening on Wednesday during the holiday when I would usually be writing that article. So that means no start-sit article this week, but because of that, I will be more active in the PFF Discord throughout the week. We'll try to answer as many questions as I can. Throughout the year, I have been answering questions specifically on Sunday mornings, but we'll be more active throughout the week. So if you have questions about players in the Wednesday game, I'll try to be active starting around Tuesday evening to answer those questions. And if you aren't in the PFF Discord yet, I did share it on both my Blue Sky and my Twitter earlier today, so you'll be able to find it there, both PFF Nate Jahnke on both places. So if you want access to the Discord, there's a link there. And after that, like I said, the podcast with John on Tuesday, and then John and I will be continuing this podcast throughout the off season as well, have at least a weekly episode in January, looking ahead to 2025 for the most part, but we'll also do a lot throughout the early parts of the off season, covering free agency, covering the draft, dynasty stuff, and generally looking ahead to 2025. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in. I hope everyone had a good week 16. With that, peace out.